Welcome to this episode of No Free Lunch Economics for a Fallen World. We're continuing our conversations in Chapter 17, History of Macroeconomics. Dr. Heyman, classical economists have several theories about business cycle, disproportionality, and general glut. Explain, please.
Sure. Well, as we talked last time after you asked about Say's Law, Say's Law was caricatured by John Maynard Keynes as meaning that supply would necessarily lead to demand, and there could be a disconnect. All the classical economists recognize that. But what they had two camps, which I would assert, and the reason I bring it out in the textbook, they still live with us today. We're still stuck in this world of these arguments. So let's look at the disproportionality, and this would be where the classical school would thought, okay, all of a sudden, we've got some sort of slackness in the market. We've got some sort of what we would call recession, what they would call a depression. And everyone would know no one wants to buy, everyone wants to sell. What would cause this? And so the answer that the classical school would assert, they would go back to Say's Law, and they would actually use Say's Law to explain why you had the depression. You would produce, so you would supply so that you might demand, but you might have a problem if you supplied things nobody wanted. And so the rationale would be there's a mix-up in the proportions of what people had wanted to buy versus what was produced. And so you could have, and the way I did it in the book, I had the example of green beans, iPhones, and cars. And I said the problem is we've had too many green beans produced, and of course that was because I don't like green beans. But the idea was this: okay, we have a certain amount of people involved in the green bean industry, and they're making all these green beans, and nobody wants all these green beans because everybody's like me and doesn't like green beans. I know you probably out there like them. Good for you. So there's too many green beans, and all of a sudden they're not selling, so the manufacturers of green beans don't have receipts from those green beans to be able to go off and buy other things. They can't come to me, who's a manufacturer of iPhones. And so I don't have sales to them because they can't get any money to buy my iPhones, so my iPhone sales start to lag. And then because my iPhone sales start to lag, I can't buy your cars that you're producing, even though I want to buy a car, but I can't. And so now you have a lack of sales, and so your business is stagnant. And so what we see is everybody's business is stagnant because there's a general carryover, because the magnitude of the imbalance, if you will, is so great it affects commerce generally. But the root cause of this is a disproportionality in production. And why this is important? Because that's true, the solution is always going to be microeconomic in nature. We need to reduce the quantities of green beans produced. We need to release those resources into other more highly valued production of iPhones and cars. We get this in the correct proportions, and then we'll be ready to move on and have a good economy.
As opposed to other schools of thought would
start
with demand. There's just insufficient demand.
Insufficient, because we're going to get to that, and that's what's going to fall out of this, and we'll get to it today. So that leads to the other school, which would say, no, they look on the shelves, all these iPhones on the shelves, all these cars on the car lot, all these green beans. There's a general glut, they would say. We have simply produced more than anybody could buy. And so in this view, the only way you can solve this problem is because there's too much production. We can call this underconsumption theories or general glut overproduction kind of theories. And the only solution for this is for it to get worked off, or if the monetary authority would print more money and extend more credit to allow all the goods that have been produced to be consumed. And so in this view, it's going to lead to Mr. Keynes, and what he would say, it leads to the bad result of actually waiting for a microeconomic solution. In fact, if you wait for this person, you're actually going to cause further harm in the process. So the solution ultimately would be what we would call in the 1800s, we call it the monetary cranks. We would call for inflation to solve this problem. And Mr. Keynes, in his general theory in the 1930s, effectively called for inflation to be able to create this additional demand as well. So the question of underconsumption and general glut theories or disproportionality is do we solve this? Is the root cause of this due to an imbalance? That would be the disproportionality. Or is it possible to produce actually too much stuff more than everybody could buy? If it's the latter, then it's a demand problem. We need government to step in and stimulate demand. If it's the former, then we have a supply side problem and we need to fix the problems on the supply side to make this economy work again. And those debates continue with us today.
Sure. And as you were talking about the general glut, wouldn't the markets, if they were free markets, be able to adjust price to work off those excess goods?
They would and they should. And the idea is that the producers of those excess goods are reluctant to sell and lower their price because they're not sufficient to cover costs. And that's the idea. What's added, and we haven't talked about it in the video, I do some in the book though, this is where monetary theory was really integrated in. You would have times of excess monetary liquidity which would stimulate too much in some particular region and then the money would be pulled back, and then that causes the financial panic that the classical economists would refer to. And that's kind of the same sort of thing we would say pretty much every business cycle theorist, even today, would at least acknowledge that money's, if not the only driver, a critical part of it to this. And but that leads to disproportionality as well, because there's a certain segment of borrowers that would have access to the money first. They overproduce because they had access to the cheaper credit, and so forth.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for your attention and for joining us today for this episode of No Free Lunch.